Welcome everybody to this Better Brains for Babies sponsored webinar. My name is Diane Bales. I am one of the co-leaders of the Better Brains for Babies initiative. Some of you I know have been through our two-day training in the past. Some have not, and that's fine. This webinar is open for anybody who is interested. I want to take the time specifically to welcome our speaker today. Bradford Wiles is an assistant professor and extension specialist at Kansas State University. Now, some of you may wonder, why do we have somebody from Kansas as part of the webinar for the Georgia Better Brains for Babies initiative? Well, let me explain. Bradford is a partner in this initiative. He has recently completed sort of an apprenticeship with us and is now considered a master trainer sharing this information in Kansas. And so we're excited to really have him as a part of the team. As we start out, I also want to acknowledge our funder for Better Brains for Babies. The Division of Family and Children's Services, Office of Prevention and Family Support are the ones who fund Better Brains for Babies, and without their support, we would not be able to do this webinar or many of the other things we do. So, without any further delay, I'm going to welcome Bradford and let him get started. As he's getting his mic unmuted, I want to point out the issue with the typo on this first slide. This is not Bradford's fault. The converter that changed the slides so that they would be in this webinar system, for some reason, moved the image over, and so that should say developmental, not evelopmental. So, Bradford, welcome. We're glad you're here. If anybody has questions during the session, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we'll get back to them. We'll also have some opportunity for you to talk later on toward the end of the session. Welcome, Bradford. We're glad you're here.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. I really appreciate the opportunity to present some information today about cognitive and neurological developmental processes. I'm sorry, Diane, I just got to give you a hard time about that. Thank you. So I do want to give just a quick background about myself. So I've been interested in early childhood for quite some time now, and in particular, how essentially genetics and our early experiences affect our long-term outcomes. And in interfacing with Better Brains for Babies with Diane, I've really come to a point where this is a really nice blend and mix of the things in which I am very interested. So I hope that you all can get something similar to that, to my interest out of it today. So to start with, we're going to talk just very briefly about the brain anatomy. Just a quick refresher for all of you. Some of these things we'll remember. Sometimes they are not as easily remembered as others. So we'll just have a quick overview of both sort of a cross section and then sort of a top-down view looking at the hemispheres and what they do. Then I'm going to present two examples of adult-child interaction and talk about the resulting pathways and processes, and then, of course, the locations in the brain where these activities really are active within the brain. Now, some of these are going to overlap because, of course, adult-child interaction, regardless of context, has some shared processes, but there are unique processes that are underlying different types of interactions, and we'll talk about two in particular. One is reading, or shared reading, which is the act of adult and child reading together, and then the other one is dancing or other physical activity, but I really focus on dancing for a lot of reasons that will become obvious as we continue. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the implications for practice and research as we learn more and more about the brain, and particularly about how important adult-child interaction is. And I do want to here at the beginning note that today I'm really focusing on positive adult-child interaction. Now, some of the things that I will talk about as we move forward have sort of the same implications as if they were in very negative context. So if you were engaging in adult-child interaction that was really terrible and very abusive, some of the same areas would be active, but they would be creating pathways that are equally strong, just in a direction that we are not really wanting to have occur. So, so let's just take a quick look now at the brain and some of the parts that we find really important. For those of you who have been through the Better Brains for Babies training, you have much of these areas down, and we will I'll address different components of these, but essentially I'll really talk through that the main part. The frontal lobe is really part of the larger processing and higher order functions. The occipital lobe has to do with vision. The brainstem these are the things that are really related to the sort of autonomous systems that we have. So things like your heartbeat, your blood pressure, your breathing, all of those kinds of things really are related to all happen in the brain. So that's the most primitive component of the brain. It's what really helps us sort of do all the things that our body needs while we engage in cognition and planning. And the cerebellum is very much an integrative component, where it really integrates information from the brain and the spinal cord, and with the rest of, from the brainstem and the spinal cord, with the rest of the systems. And the basal ganglia are really around smooth coordinations of movement, really help us in making our actions fluid. And the parietal lobes are responsible for a number of things having to do with motor control and hand-eye coordination and things to that effect. So we'll get to more and more of these as we go. The deep limbic system, though, if you can see there on the left-hand side, it points right to the middle. That really has to do with emotions and with how we react to stimuli in our environment. And so that, of course, will have a lot to do with social emotional development and how we as humans react to our environments, and how we sort of the start of our reactions before it gets filtered through the rest of our brains, and then we act on them, if you get my meaning. So that's sort of the cross section of the brain. And then we're going to look at the hemispheres, and we all have these, I think we all sort of, when we think about basics of brain anatomy, we all understand left brain, right brain, right? Left brain is like logic, math, facts, figures, you're like remembering those kinds of things, particularly remembering details. The right brain is all about creativity, imagination, rhythm, your feelings, although some of those things come across different hemispheres, but really, I think if you look at sort of a great example, or if the left brain is really the words of songs and the right brain is really the tune, right? And so I really appreciate that differentiation. some of us are more left brain dominant than right brain. It really depends on what you do. You know, a lot of people seem to think that scientists are very left brain driven. And while we are involved, you know, while we do have logic and analysis, there's a certain amount of creativity that goes along with being a scientist that you have to draw on from your right brain. So as we are there any questions about the basic brain anatomy before I proceed any further? And it does not seem to be that, but please feel free to raise your hand. There's a button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions as I go through, please don't hesitate. But those are really the sort of the extent to which I'm going to cover the brain anatomy today as an overview. Now, we will start to get into the processes in the brain and the locations and then the pathways that occur as a result of adult-child interactions. So we know that there are some hallmarks of child development in relation to the brain. One of them, of course, is there's a really rapid increases in brain development from 0 to 3. That's not to say it stops after 3, of course, but that period of time is really, really intense when it comes to the development. And that's where we start to really hone our sensory capabilities. And we really focus on play, sleep, and then adult-child interaction. And you know, if you think about what children from 0 to 3 do and need, that's a whole lot of what they need to do. Now, obviously, they need to take care of their functions for, toileting, and they need to take baths and those kinds of things. There is but those things all occur in the context of adult-child interaction, right? Very, very little of the things that we as infants and toddlers have happen are outside of the context of adult-child interaction. There's some play that occurs. We sleep, but even eating and all of the other things that we do really do generally in the positive. I want to say in this positive vein happen in the context of adult-child interaction. Now, please don't get me wrong. There are certainly occasions where adult-child interaction is not a hallmark of child development from 0 to 3, and as a result, there are impoverished areas of the brain that occur because we are necessarily social beings. And so, what are the hallmarks of those adult-child interactions? Well, the adult-child interactions, they provide opportunities for neural pathway development, and as we know, that the more repetition there is, the stronger the neural pathways. So this works both ways, of course, right? If you are doing well and you're encouraged to do well and you keep doing the same thing and you're doing it well, that will get stronger. So for example, language development is a perfect example here, where the more you hear language, the more you begin to produce language, the stronger those pathways become. When you're not exposed to different languages, in particular language sounds, then your capacity for building those neural pathways and those neural networks declines rapidly. After the age of about 6 months, we begin to stop being able to hear different sounds from different languages. So one of the most salient of those is for people who are native speakers of many of the Asian language. There is not an R sound in those languages. And so when they try to learn English or other Germanic types of languages that do have R sounds, their brains literally do not hear the R sound. It sounds like an L to them. Thus, when they produce the R sound, it sounds like an L. It's not a failing of their or their ability to produce speech. It really is that their brains have pruned away the ability to differentiate those things because it wasn't important to them. And so that's really important as we think about the processes for neural pathways. It's really important to be able to understand how those pathways are strengthened as a result of exposure. And then along those same lines, and I'm just going to stop for just a second. If anybody's on the phone, could you just mute your line for me so that I don't hear the conversation in the background? Thanks. And so another perfect example of the how important adult-child interaction is language development, and then of course how we do other mentored processes like learning to read or learning mathematics. So, neural pathways are so in conclusion there for that section, they're strengthened by repetition and practice, right? And practice is really important here too, because it doesn't mean that you don't make any mistakes. I mean, that's why we practice. So, for example, when you're learning language, you might say her instead of she, or, I are instead of I am, and those kinds of things. And so it is practice, but over time, those things get more and more strengthened to the point where now we don't even think about the pronouns we use, we just use them. And they become almost automatic. And then positive adult-child interaction provides safe opportunities. And this is a hallmark of positive adult-child interaction is there's a safety component. There's some other things that are involved, including things like intersubjectivity and mind-mindedness that we'll talk about a little bit, and also some scaffolding processes that I'll talk about as well. So then there's of course, the opposite is that negative adult-child interaction increases the likelihood of neural pathways, reinforcing those stress responses. So there are all kinds of things that happen in terms of stress responses. So when there's positive adult-child interaction, stress is lowered. There are endorphins. There are things that happen that make children more excited and more attentive and more engaged. And then, of course, for negative adult-child interaction, there's the opposite sorts of chemicals are released. So cortisol and other stress hormones are released that increase the likelihood of avoidance and increase the foundational state of excitement in a way that makes paying attention much more difficult. Let me say, paying attention to positive stimuli much more difficult. So, so this is a model of adult-child interactional processes, and I want to say this model is very, very complex. But essentially, what you have on the left-hand side, if I can use my pointer here, is you have a more experienced person, usually an adult, and you have a less experienced person. But this is important because while we're talking today about adult-child interaction, this process can happen with any more or less experienced peer. But what happens from the adult to the child are these notions of scaffolding and guided participation. And these things we operationalize as asking questions, offering instruction, providing modeling, some feedback, helping maintain focus, providing cognitive structures, so ways to think about things. And then, of course, all the nonverbal communication that goes along with those. And then as the child processes these things, there's this continual intentional assessment of what's happening, of what's going on from the adult, and their intentions. They learn, they understand, and they develop this theory of mind, which I'll talk about a little bit, but for right now, just think about it as understanding that other people are different than you are. And then from the child's side, the child's contribution, they're looking at providing this active engagement and interest. And we know that when children are actively engaged and interested, that's when they learn the most. That's when their brains are most active. That's when the potential for them to learn and retain the knowledge is highest, is when they are interested and when the adult is making efforts to actively engage with them. And so then that feeds into the more experienced person's dialectical process, which is this continual intentional assessment of what the child needs and what they know and what they understand, and they're developing that relationship with the child, right? And so in between all this is this component of mind-mindedness and mindfulness, or being aware of what's happening. And this whole thing occurs within the context of a process called intersubjectivity, which is a shared understanding, and I'll talk through that a little bit. So within these processes, there's a number of different developmental domains that are at work. So there's the cognitive development. So we're learning, all kinds of things can be learned in the context of adult-child interaction, but specifically things like literacy and numeracy are necessarily driven by adult-child interaction. The idea that that you can learn to read without a more experienced person helping is, I mean, it can't happen. I mean, it's necessarily mentored. If you think about how we teach anyone to learn to read or to do math, it requires somebody who's more experienced, because you have to be able to identify what the foundations are. And then, of course, in social emotional development, there's this notion of theory of mind, and how we then understand and express our feelings, and adults are models for that, and they also are the first people that we can really bounce these things off of, and really understand the cause and effect of our feelings, and then begin to get a name for them and be able to process them both cognitively and within our neural pathways, right? So when you think about understanding and expressing feelings, you express a feeling, but then how do you come to understand that? That's sort of a more cognitive process as opposed to a social emotional process, if you get my meaning. So as adult-child interactions form, we have this component called intersubjectivity. And this is really the foundation for all of our adult interactions. Intersubjectivity are essentially the shared, unwritten rules of engagement, of how we as adults begin to interact, because we don't now as adults have to stop and say, okay, you're going to talk, I'm going to listen, then I'm going to talk and you're going to listen, and we're going to sit here and we're going to exchange some pleasantries before we begin the business of what we have at hand, et cetera, right? And we don't have to do this anymore, because we have this component called intersubjectivity. Perfect example, today we've been on webinars before. You understand that I'm going to present some information. You're likely going to listen a little bit. If you have to answer, have to ask a question, you can raise your hand. But because we don't have complete intersubjectivity, Diane had to introduce some of the functions that are available to you using the chat box. I had to sort of tell you about raising your hand. And so that is contributing to future intersubjectivity, and we now have a shared understanding. What is true intersubjectivity is not having to address those things. Now, if I started breaking into the Indiana University fight song right now, I would break our intersubjectivity because we would all wonder what the heck I was doing. And so what's interesting is that children don't really understand that, though. I mean, we've all been around children that suddenly break off and do something completely unexpected and completely bizarre, and that's because they don't have that shared understanding yet. And that's part of what develops in the context of adult-child interactions, right? And so the other real hallmark of adult-child interactions as they pertain to brain development is really this notion of theory of mind. And theory of mind is the understanding that other people have different thoughts, beliefs, desires, and behaviors than your own. It's recognizing that that people can make other decisions than you would. And when you're very young, that is completely lost on you. Or for young children, we all have experienced this. If we spend any time around young children, they don't seem to understand why people would do something that they wouldn't do. One of the best tests of theory of mind, whether children have it or not, is essentially a task where it's called a hidden situation task. You show a child a picture of a character putting, let's say, a spoon in a drawer and closing the drawer, and then a different character comes in, and you ask the child if that character knows where the spoon is. If the child doesn't have a theory of mind, the child will say, yeah, the new person knows that the spoon is in the drawer. If a child does have a theory of mind, they will understand that that new person won't know where it is unless that person had a conversation, right? And so it's really this understanding that not all knowledge is universal to everyone, that each individual has their own autonomy and is not privy to all the understandings that everyone else has. This, once again, is really one of the foundations of adult social interactions. I am going to ask you all to raise your hand if any of you have ever met anyone who who you felt did not have a very good theory of mind, who really didn't understand that other people don't exist essentially for their pleasure. Can anybody raise their hand and show me that they have? Yes, Diane has. All right. Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. And it's really fascinating. And the other element is we also, some of us have dated people who don't have very good understandings of other people's thoughts, beliefs, and desires and behaviors. And some of us have even married people that are like that. And for those of you who are still married to them, I wish you the best of luck. Now, I don't tend to, okay, and you can lower your hands if you like, but thank you for that. I don't tend to focus on a lot of outliers, but I will say that theory of mind is one of the things that people who are high functioning on the autism spectrum tend to not really have. So one of the best demonstrations of this was a record of a very high functioning individual on the autism spectrum who said, and I quote, "I'm not very good in social situations, or so I'm told," end quote. And the "or so I'm told" is so important there, because without a theory of mind, that individual can't recognize other people's thoughts, beliefs, desires, and can't pick up on those social cues that all the rest of us can, right? So this theory of mind is really about being able to also predict other people's reactions. And for people who don't have that, they can't do that, and they can't pick up on those social cues. They can't really understand why people react the way they do. They don't even understand that people might be put off by what they're saying. If you think about how important understanding other people's thoughts, beliefs, and desires and how they're different than your own are, you can really understand how important this theory of mind is for positive child development, and how really the only way to get really good understanding of that is through positive adult-child interaction, right? So the next component that's really a hallmark of positive adult-child interaction is this concept called mind-mindedness. And this is from a researcher named Elizabeth Maines and her colleagues in the UK. And this is really thinking about the child's mind and brain as they're developing. So we are consistently, as adults, focused on meeting needs of children, right? That we're focused on are they washed? Are they fed? Are they, do they not have any thirst? Do they have the, are they warm? Are they cold? Are they, these kinds of things. And don't get me wrong, we need to focus on those things. Those things are crucially important. But what these researchers have found is that adults who think about the child as a developing mind, not just as a being with needs, tend to have much, much higher levels of positive interactions, and it has long-term implications for attachment relationships. And if you take attachment to be the foundation for adult relationships, you can see that an adult who thinks about a child as a developing mind really positions their child to do much, much better in terms of how they interface with other human beings, right? So not only are they modeling this thinking about other people as intelligent beings, but they also are predicting and providing a closeness with the child that has really long-term implications for attachment. And you can imagine that this also has a lot of implications for how the brain processes this interaction with their primary caregiver, right? That getting back to the repetition and how important that is, if every time or almost every time that you're interacting with your primary caregiver, you are getting these positive experiences and they're thinking about you in a way that addresses you as a person, then you're going to start to tend to think about yourself as a person, and you're going to think about other people as a person, right? So let's take all that stuff and then let's talk about. I'll give an example. The first example, which is really shared reading. So before I get into the examples, do we have any questions so far? Okay. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. So shared reading is the act of reading a book together. And full disclosure, this is what I did my dissertation research on in rural Appalachian Head Start families. It was a tremendous experience. And so one of the things that's really important when we think about breaking down shared reading and emergent literacy, which is this process of learning to read, it's necessarily social, meaning you have to have some other person to help you, because if you can't read, you can't decipher the code that then helps you learn to make sense of the symbols, right? It doesn't matter if you have the Rosetta Stone. If you don't know how to read the Rosetta Stone, then you don't know how to make sense of the symbols. And And then, of course, what shared reading does is it requires multiple domains of neural pathway development. And don't get me wrong, everything that we do requires multiple domains, but there are specific and important locations and pathways that develop during this process of emergent literacy, and in the context of shared reading in particular. So I'm going to go through shared reading and cognitive development, and then social emotional development. So the regions in the brain that have to do with cognitive development in the context of shared reading are, so one of the things about shared reading is we learn about print functions, and then of course we learn how to read. And those happen within the occipital lobe. So the print functions are, of course, they're part of the vision, right? We're reading, and so we have to be able to see those things. That's where our brain processes those things. And then we also are developing our vocabulary, which is part of the frontal lobes, right? And that's where we really start to build our vocabulary, to understand, to make that linkage between what we're reading and what those symbols are, right? So if you think about the frontal lobes as that more higher order thinking, that's where the linkage really comes in. And then as we're learning to read, we're also learning our language, right? And so that's, let me say, shared reading, of course, is reading aloud with children. I should have said that. But reading aloud, and that's where we really start to pick up on these phonemes, right? The individual speech sounds. And so that involves hearing, which is in the temporal lobe, and Wernicke's area, which is really how we process speech. So it's that receptive language area in the temporal lobe. But then also, of course, we're learning how to produce these speech sounds, and that's in Broca's area, which is also on the temporal lobe on the other side. And so you can see that all of these different areas are at work in just this cognitive component of learning to read, right? But what we know about learning to read is that it is not simply or merely a cognitive process, right? It's also a social emotional process, right? That within the domain of shared reading, we're learning about theory of mind, which has a lot to do, and there's been an entire bookshelf worth of literature about where theory of mind develops within the brain. I just got done reading a really interesting article about how they tested 4 separate theoretical ideas of where theory of mind within the brain might develop. And the conclusions were largely that everybody could agree that it was in the frontal and temporoparietal, so that the front of the parietal lobe there, which is that's where the temporal and the parietal lobes meet, and it's at on either side, and then emotion recognition. So one of the crazy things about reading and about learning to read is children start to then understand the emotions of the characters that are in the book, right? They talk about being happy, they talk about being sad, they talk about, being excited. And all of these things register both in our sort of more developed components. So particularly with regard to the frontal lobes, but then they also are within the limbic system and the amygdala and the hypothalamus, right? So the amygdala really acts as the emotional processing center of the brain. It responds to stimuli, which especially like danger and things like that. But it also really assists with the recognition of emotions in others. So not only does it recognize it in books, but also, of course, in the adult with whom the child is reading, right? So This is where children start to sense whether they're evoking some negative or positive emotion within their parents, right? So, for example, if a child masters a new word, they can sense that joy from their adult, from the adult with whom they're reading, and their amygdala and the hypothalamus, which really the hypothalamus influences the emotional responses of the limbic system, and it regulates the hormone secretion. So this is the part of the brain that really gets at how excited the child is in response to their adult's joy or sorrow or whatever emotion they're getting at. But you can see how important this shared activity is. Just this simple act of reading aloud together, how complex the interaction actually is, because it's not just learning ABCs. It's so much more than that. And it's not just learning, how to decode our language. While that's important, that's not, that is not nearly comprehensive enough to really get at what's happening. And then finally, of course, in the shared reading context, there's some inhibitory control. There's some learning how to make sure that you are paying attention and are working on mastery of language, and I will also add the prefrontal cortex is at work here too, where it's really responsible for exercising judgment and being able to sort of look at how to react to what's going on within this shared reading context. So that's something that happens while essentially you're sitting, usually, oftentimes it's one-on-one, sometimes it's, an adult with 3 or 4 kids, or, maybe even more, but it's generally pretty sedentary. I mean, I like to see adults and children get up and model different behaviors and, make different sounds and all that. But that's sort of something that doesn't have a lot to do with motor coordination or motor function. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is shared dancing. And I need to say that this can also include, a lot of this can include things like learning sports as well. But I have a particular interest in the effects that dance has on physical, cognitive, and social emotional development. But a lot of these things can transfer into other domains of healthy physical activity. So anything having to do with sports or exercise, so long as it occurs within a shared mentored type of process. And much like reading, dancing is something that almost universally is done in a mentored process. Now, one big difference, of course, is that with reading, you can't learn unless you know the code. But in dancing, you can actually just observe and learn, right? It takes a little bit longer, but it is something that is not necessarily social, although I will say it helps a lot. Much like you can learn to kick a soccer ball on your own, but it sure does help when you have a coach who's teaching you how to kick a soccer ball for the first time. If anybody's ever watched children who have not had any coaching on how to kick a soccer ball, you'll see that they rarely use the inside of their foot. They almost always use the toe, and they are often very wayward with where they put it. So so I'm going to go through a few of these things. So when we think about shared dancing and cognitive development, it really stems from Solberg and Matier's more recent work, building on Luria's work of anticipation, planning, execution, and self-monitoring. So this is really about physical activity and how we control our bodies and how we think about what we're doing, right? So there's initiation and drive, which is sort of how we start to do it. There's response inhibition, how we stop doing things, and again, these things are not sort of cognitive per se, meaning we don't have to think about them. They're just things that we do. There's task persistence. So how hard do we try? How hard do we practice? How long and how how much desire do we have before we give up? This is where I really think about hustle, right? And how dedicated we are to doing what we want to do. So if you're talking about in the context of dance, how many times you're willing to keep trying and failing before you either give up or you master. And then, of course, the other three: organization, generative thinking, and awareness. So that higher level process is really, really important as we begin to master things, because then you can monitor your own behavior and modify it. Whereas before you get into those higher order processes, it really takes the more experienced peer or adult to help to monitor you, right? So this step from execution to self-monitoring is a really important leap, because that's where you are able to then self-correct, whereas before it required the intervention of an adult to correct. And so, so shared dancing and social emotional development. I have this asterisk here because this looks extraordinarily similar to what goes on in the shared reading context. And in fact, it is exactly the same. And that's because this all occurs within the context of adult-child interaction. Now, the next talk that I will give at some point is going to be really focused around music and playing instruments and their effects and processes within the brain. So I'm not going to steal my own thunder there, but I do want to say that while these components are of theory of mind and emotion recognition and inhibitory control are highlights of shared dancing, there are other things that go along with music and rhythm that contribute to our understanding of emotions and helping us process them, that are sort of outside of the adult-child interaction framework with which we're focused today. But know that many of the processes that are occurring within the shared reading environment have similar power within the shared dancing. If you think about it, very similar processes: mentored and engaged. And then the biggest difference, though, of course, is that there's physical development that's going on within the context of dancing, right? So planning, control, execution of movement, that all happens in the motor cortex, and then the motor control and hand-eye coordination, which is in the somatosensory cortex, which is right in the mid-region of the brain. So it's sort of right there in the middle, across the top too. And then the basal ganglia are responsible for that smooth coordination of movement. So why we don't look like robots, right? Where it's this set of sort of start and stop and start and stop. My father drives like he doesn't have any basal ganglia. He drives, we call it the glide and jerk method. He glides and then jerks his car and then glides and then jerks his car and then glides. It's as if he doesn't have this ability to just drive smoothly. It's really, 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 really obnoxious. But anyway, I love him. I just don't like to ride with him. And then finally, one of the other elements of physical development is, of course, integrating input from the brain and the spinal cord, and then incorporating the fine and complex motor responses to what's going on. And that's where the cerebellum really comes in. That's sort of the component that is responsible for smoothing out all of these, not smoothing out so much as integrating all of these different responses from the different systems that are going on in our body, particularly having to do with balance and coordination and our motor control. And so, as you can see, the dancing component adds a layer of complexity to development, but of course, learning to read has very different complexities as well, right? So what does it all mean, right? What does that all mean? So the take-home messages today are that adult-child interactions have profound effects on brain development, right? That any of these adult-child interactions have meaningful and identifiable effects on brain development. I think one other thing is that we don't think of child development as a whole as a really mentored process. I think we tend to think of it as sort of children get together and play, and that that we don't have nearly as much effect on their developing brains as we actually do. And don't get me wrong, I want to make very clear that mentored here means also more experienced peers, but generally for young children, they are learning from adults. And so it's really incumbent upon us as researchers and practitioners to understand the implications for how important these mentored activities are in the vast majority of children who are, I want to say, typically developing. How many different areas of the brain and how many different processes are at work in any given scenario, and how important it is that that these shared experiences influence both children and adults. I want to go harken back to that model where the adult is also learning from the child and learning about the child. And I think it's really important that we understand that our adult brains are also plastic and can incorporate new information about how we interact with children. But the reality is that these neural pathways are reinforced by positive adult-child interaction, and in many cases, adult-child interaction is the only way that they get built and reinforced. So finally, I would like to just acknowledge Diane at the University of Georgia Extension, Shanisha Roberson as well, who helped me become a master trainer in a Better Brains for Babies curriculum in Georgia. I really enjoyed my time down there. And then, of course, the funder as well, the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services and the Office of Prevention and Family Support. So I really appreciate your time today, and would then just like to answer any questions you might have for me.
Thanks so much, Bradford. We really appreciate this is great information. Hopefully everybody's gotten some new things. If you have questions, if you will either raise your hand or type them in the chat box, we're going to give a couple minutes for people to respond, and then we will wrap up the webinar and have some kind of concluding details.
And don't be shy. I don't bite. I mean, as far as you're aware.
Anybody have something you want to ask Bradford? Or ways that this might apply to what you do, or anything like that?
All right. Well, in the absence of a question, I will just.
I think we've got one, Bradford. Novella.
Okay.
Are you able to talk, Novella, or do you need to type your question? Or maybe there wasn't a question after all.
Yeah. Oh, would you be able to get a copy of some of the research? Yes, absolutely. In fact, what I would do is I'll provide Diane with a list of references and essentially a bibliography of some of the studies that I cited here. I didn't provide a references slide, but I certainly can and will do that. Some of the stuff is just absolutely fascinating. It is really mind-boggling.
And we'll make sure that information gets onto the Better Brains website and send you out that information.
But I'll make sure to get that out. I usually do prepare a references slide. I just did not do that today. But yeah, happy to provide that. It's really fascinating. I particularly in all of the different domains that adult-child interaction affects the way that our brains are wired for the long term.
Any other questions for Bradford? Bradford, I want to very much express on behalf of myself and certainly on behalf of Better Brains for Babies, appreciation for you taking the time to be here.
Well, as you know, it's my pleasure, and I'm happy to do it. As I said, I'd be happy to also provide another looking at music and its effect on the brain, the developing brain.